Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, a weekly podcast by Lace Partners, a fundamentally different HR and payroll consultancy. Each week, we tackle some of the most interesting topics facing senior HR professionals. So whether that's from employee value proposition, performance management, people strategy, or even payroll, we cover it all. So join us for the next 30 minutes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, on with the show. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you as always for our latest edition of our weekly podcast series in which we talk all things HR. And today we are talking all things HR with our founder of Lace Partners. It's the fabulous Aaron Alburey. How are you doing, sir?
Hello, Chris. I'm doing well. You?
Yeah, really good. And excited to get into this one because I haven't really given the listeners a hint as to what we're going to be talking about today. But it's a topic that I think I had you on the pod the last time we were speaking, and that's HR's role in business transformation. So We talked about what you're seeing at the moment in the market when you go out and you talk to lots of clients or prospects or just friends of Lace, and the increasing demand and desire that we're seeing for HR to really be front and center on the people aspect of business transformation. So the reason why we're talking today is because we wanted to get into a little bit more detail on some research that we've conducted, because you and I spoke and we were very much talking from a position of what you're hearing in the market, but we've actually gone and done some research now, haven't we? So excited to get into the detail of that. But
excellent.
Before we do that, the tradition of this podcast, as you well know, is that fundamentally different question. And now, Aaron, I have just read a story online about a duck in the UK who is a repeat offender. And he's a repeat offender because he keeps getting flashed on camera, a speed camera no less, but a camera breaking the speed limit. And so that's coming up and popping up. So my fundamentally different and completely random question to you is either a speed camera that you'd like, an animal that you would just love to see break a speed camera, or if you want to, if you'd prefer, if you've got a home sort of security system at home where like a Ring or whatever it is, other systems are available, ladies and gentlemen. What would you like to see? What animal would you like to see recorded on your home security system?
Wow, that's a great question. I think if it's a speed camera, I've got to say a giant land snail, just for the irony of it all. And then I think that at home, I'd love to see a pangolin. They're just so cute. So pangolins it is for me. I know they're not in this country, and if they are, they're probably here illegally. So pangolins.
So I would go for, I love monkeys, so it'd be some kind of a rapid monkey, and I'd kill two birds with one stone there, because that's a speeding monkey.
I think, Chris, it depends on what it's driving, I think is the answer to that.
Very good, very good, very good. Let's segue away from the concept of monkeys breaking the speed limit by driving cars and focus more on this research that we've done.
Yes.
I'll give a few, just for the listeners, for the benefit of the listeners, I'll give them a little bit of an overview as to the methodology and the research that we conducted. But then if I can get you to just talk a little bit about why we decided to run this research as well. So just for the benefit of setting the scenes, earlier on this year in 2025, Q1 2025, we went out to 450 different respondents. They were all C-suite, all working for organizations, 5,000 plus. It was split across predominantly the UK. We had 250 out of the 450 who were in the UK. And then there was other areas like North America or the GCC in the Middle East. We broke that down into 7 different sectors. We really did focus on the CPOs. So the focus was on getting 250 CPOs to give us their thoughts around the evolving role of HR in business transformation. And then we also wanted to talk to the C-suite as well. So it's CEOs, CFOs, CTOs, and COOs to get a perspective from across the boardroom table. Do you want to just give our listeners a bit of a flavour as to the reason why we conducted it? And then we'll get into some of the details, because I think there's some fascinating stuff around around the CPO's role or the CHRO's role in shaping the relationship between the CPO, CHRO, and the CEO and the rest of the C-suite, and why people work streams fail to deliver. But let's just start as to the reasons why we decided to conduct this research.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, it's a great point, Chris. You mentioned the podcast that we had done before on this topic. And I think we mentioned back then, we did some research, or rather a white paper with some interviews, let's call it that, last year, which was very insightful. It sort of raised some early indicators that things had changed in the market around the involvement of the people function in business transformation. And so I think we had a strong view that was forming that more than ever before, certainly more than before COVID, the people functions were getting engaged and CPOs were getting engaged much earlier in the discussion around business transformation, were much more critical in the success of that. To be successful, there were some challenges that they had to overcome. And I think we saw inklings of that in the previous report and the interviews. And so we wanted to research it and really have a look with some data, as you say, across that 450 respondents and understand what does that start to show us. Subsequently, we've also run a couple of events. We were at the HR Directors event recently, and also have run some of our CPO networks and clients that we know well to get their perspectives as well. And I think it's been really interesting, and I know we're going to get into it, to understand that how that role has evolved. What does it look like now? What are the things to watch out for that still fall short? But what is the trend, and what are we seeing, at least from the data and the respondents that we spoke to?
So we're going to go to the data bit in a second, but you mentioned the HR Director event that we went to, and we started to, it was almost a bit of a qualitative sort of focus group exercise, wasn't it, for you? So is there anything in terms of what was played back to us that you can pick out as these were some of the interesting points that were mentioned on the day, but then what we'll do is we'll get into some of the research that we've got. And just for the benefit of you, if you're listening in, we will be releasing a research paper with a little bit more detail on some of our thinking around some of the data. That will probably come out later in 2025. But just for the purposes, what we decided to do was run some of these events. We're doing today's podcast as an example, just so that we can play back some of the interesting initial things that we've found. And then over the summer, we'll be putting together a more detailed overview of some of those findings. But talk to me a little bit around that HR Director. Was there any, maybe one or two nuggets that you just thought, really interesting that we had this played back to us?
I think when we had those conversations, a couple of things struck me. One was that we had 12 CPOs in the room, and every single one of those was dealing with a very diverse portfolio of change in their businesses. For some, it was about diversification, and that was either a divestment or an acquisition. For others, it was, a cost play in their organization, and they were having to look with the C-suite around restructuring. And for others, it was a real perspective on the impact that AI and digital was having on their business and their portfolio, and what that meant for talent and skills across the organization. I think sitting in a room with the CPOs, what struck me was how many of them were engaged in scale change, and how many of them were dealing with multiple dimensions of change at the same time. I think the other couple of things that struck us as we went through those conversations, and it will play out in some of this data in a minute, was they were all involved very early in that process of the business change. And I think that hasn't been the case historically in a lot of functions, and isn't the case in all functions by any means, in all examples of HR. But certainly in that group, there was a big discussion about how early they were engaged, the different levels of engagement, and also just how close they were to their CEOs, almost to a person. They were in daily contact, daily dialogue around the business change going on in the organization with their CEOs, navigating that, helping them manage it and work it through. So I think several of them talked about developing purposeful change cultures in their organization. So thinking about the mindset they needed to develop in their organizations for change, talking about constant change, the ability to adapt to that on a regular basis, and the need for creating safe environments around which change could be executed well. As always, when you get HR professionals together right now and you talk about business change, the other big topic that always comes up is AI, and navigating what that might mean to their business and the uncertainty that comes with that, and the understanding that it is going to be something that will play out in most organizations in the future. So a really good conversation. I think the other thing is it did reinforce a lot of what we've seen from the research and the data. Not all of it. There were some challenge points, but I think it did definitely reinforce that too.
Okay, so I want to get into some of the data now, and I'm going to start. I was going to talk to you about, because you mentioned about when CPOs are brought into the transformation, like at what stage they're brought in. I'm going to ask you to park that just for a second, because I know you mentioned when you were in that HR director's discussion, you were talking around, a lot of them were discussing about how important it was and how they were all going through some sort of change programs. But our data actually said the reason why work streams fail, it said 33% said it was because of weak change management. So do you get that sense of that being an outlier, that data point of essentially what we're saying is 1 in 3 of the respondents are saying that work streams are failing to deliver on outcomes because of weak change management. Did you get that sense, given the conversation seemed to center, or one of the big points that you talked about centered around the importance of change and delivering change? Did you get that sense in the room? What's your take on that 33%?
No, I think there's a couple of things that play into that. I think there's a couple of good positives from this. One is that change is recognized as being incredibly important to land successfully business transformation. That's one thing. The second is that most people would recognize they don't have enough change management capability in their organizations or in the HR function. I think that is relatively consistent to most dialogues and discussions that we have. The degree then to which, with the resources and the capability you have, you can deliver is varied depending on organization. I think the other reflection that we had in the room was a desire, with the level of change that is going on, not to be dependent on consultants to deliver that change, because so much of it, you need something systemic in your organization. So you're not reliant on consultants to deliver that. And we talked at length around joining up change programs across a business and the role that HR plays in making sure that that is consistently applied, and there's not one consultancy doing it one way and another doing it another way and a contractor doing it a third way. It's how do you bring those together in a consistent framework within your organization to ensure that the impact on people is felt in a consistent way. So, yeah, I think it's quite a blunt element in this report around the 1/3 have weak change management. I think there's lots of different things that contribute to that, I guess, is the point. I think it's well recognized that there are things that could be done better.
We're going to go on to the next question, actually, which is around at what stage CPOs or the HR function is brought in to either lead the transformation agenda or making a decision. And some of the stats that we've had played back to us was 93% of the HR leaders suggesting that they were leading on the transformation agenda, but only 52% are brought in when the implementation begins. What's your kind of reading on that?
It was a really interesting discussion. I think my first reading is actually a really positive one, Chris, which is we are seeing through this survey and the discussions we're having much more engagement of the people function and the HR function early in the process of business change. So before it becomes a fait accompli, before it's thrown over a wall and is asked to be executed. So actually in shaping it and in planning it, which is great. It's a great trend. It's great to see over time. No doubt COVID, Brexit, et cetera, have all added to the kudos of HR to be able to deliver these kind of pieces of work. So that's great. I think what the data says to us and what we hear again in the conversations is it's a mixed bag as to how many HR professionals are brought in at strategy versus planning and execution. And that still is very mixed. And we see some people brought in early, shaping with a CEO and the C-suite the strategy around business transformation. And then we see others who are brought in once that strategy is decided to help plan the execution, then execute. Still early, planning the execution is still early. You still shift things at that stage, but not necessarily in the strategy. And I think that's where, from a data perspective and from those conversations, there is more that could be done for some organizations to get engaged earlier in that strategy side.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually, because again, the stat that I just pulled out, I think that was of that 93% is around HR leaders saying that they lead. But then when we surveyed the entire sort of population of 450 across the C-suite, they were then saying that essentially we've got 37% across the C-suite say that the reason why people work streams fail is because HR is involved too late in the process. Do you think that's kind of an acknowledgement from the whole of the C-suite that we recognise that there's more to do here? Because if HR leaders themselves are saying, 93% of them are saying that we're either leading the agenda or the decision maker, we're playing an active role, but 37% are saying we're too late, you're involved too late in the HR process. Do you think there's more work to do in that relationship between CPO and C-suite?
I think there's always work to do in those relationships. I think, it's quite interesting when you talk to those who have successfully led through or been a part of the leadership team through big business transformation. They talk about working in lockstep with the rest of the C-suite. They talk about working arm in arm. They talk about how that relationship from CFO and COO or CTO is so critical to the success. And so I do think it is a very important dimension to business transformation. And I think our data and the conversations we've had subsequently reflect that that is not always where it needs to be. Certainly, there seems to be stronger relationships established, right? I think one of the things that our results show is that the relationship between the CEO and the CPO is very close and strong. We see that quite often. But I think also one of our other data points is that less than 50% of the CFOs we talked to felt that HR was really aligned to the business strategy and the business plan. So I think there are some particular challenges in those C-suite relationships that continue to be required to be focused on. Each of our listeners will have a different view on their C-suite and their relationships. But certainly, I think it was a really good data set, as I say, that a lot of the CEOs felt their CPOs were critical to shaping business transformation, which is great to see.
Yeah, and just to play on a couple of other the stats that we got out in terms of the rest of the C-suite that I just want to get your kind of read on, which links into what we were talking about there. 46% of those say that business leaders don't view HR as central to transformation. 34% of CTOs say that HR is siloed, and 54% of CEOs say HR leaders are involved when decisions are being made. So I'll just hit you with a few stats there. I just want you to reflect, if that's all right, on each of those and what you think that means.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because I think when that COO one that is, you mentioned there, 46% of chief operating officers in our survey thought that business leaders don't view HR as central to transformation. Understanding of management, the management mid-layer around the importance of the people aspect of transformation and the role that HR has in helping them execute that. And so I think that is certainly an area that is really interesting because we know that business transformations can get stuck in that middle layer around management when there is a lot of change to be done around accountability roles, ways of working, etc. We would all clearly say there is a very strong case for HR to be involved in there and help the transformation. But that seems not to be translating into the views of some of the people who responded to our survey. I think on the CTO saying that HR is siloed, I think it's really interesting because I think the CTOs typically see, I think, across a lot of the organization, the technologies tend to be they're trying to integrate technologies. A lot of their goal is to try and reach that, is to cut across silos. It's one that is also reflected, I think, in the CFO statistics that talk about HR being too reactive in terms of their responses as well. So I think there's definitely work to be done in that space. And for those who've worked in HR for a long time, we do often see a gap between reward, talent, performance, core HR, payroll happening, in particular around sort of technology and the way things operate and work. And then you layer on top of that business partners and COEs and operations. There are lots of different ways in which HR can appear siloed to the organization. Clearly an area to build on. And I think it's that one approach to change is the goal that we're trying to get to. And then we've talked a little bit about that earlier stat around engagement of HR leaders and when they're involved in decision making. I think we've got what seems to be a very strong relationship with the CEO in most organizations that we surveyed between the CEO and the CPO, but not necessarily translating into involving them early enough in some of the business strategy. Though I have to say, we've had a couple of sessions since, Chris, where we've talked to a lot of the transformational CPOs that we operate with, and almost to a person, they are very involved in that strategy element and setting. So it is an interesting one to dig in further, I think.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, just a couple of points on there. One of them is a tongue-in-cheek point on the CTOs saying HR is siloed. Well, one solution for organizations like Moderna has obviously been to combine both roles of CPO and CTO. Actually, are you all right to just give me your take on that? Because that seems quite a strange decision. I mean, it obviously works for them and fair play, but they're two very different functions and have two different levels of complexity. But what was your initial take on that when you heard that? And particularly given this research that we talk about?
It's really interesting. We were debating this at one of the other events with some CPOs. And I think in that case, the view was that the CTO's accountabilities had come under the CPO's accountabilities. That's when they talk about merging, it was a merging into the HR accountabilities. And I think the perspective was that actually, in some ways, if you think about, as we've talked about on other podcasts, experience, engagement, the importance of those other attributes around digital and physical environments and the importance they have on experience, you can see the argument for saying actually technology and the way it's used in our business is so impactful on the experience of our people that why would you not have those things carefully aligned through one leader? So I think I can see the rationale for doing it. I think the challenge, as always, with that kind of merged role is that they are very different skill sets. It's the same when we see legal and HR coming together. In some ways, it makes a lot of sense to have it through one leadership team. But I think, again, they are very different skill sets. And so that is your risk that you need to manage when you put those kind of two organizations together.
Certainly. It's a really fascinating almost case study. We've had a lot of interest from national and business press just asking us about our take on this kind of merging. And it's a complex one, as it is for all businesses making those sort of decisions. We've got about 5 minutes left. And I just want to touch on the side of data here. One of the other stats or elements that came out of the discussion, which is the prevalence of HR, the CPO, the CHRO, using workforce data to guide the business transformation decisions. One of the stats that we had came out was only half of all managers say that HR lacks analytical capability to use data in business transformation planning. Can I just get a bit of a thought from you? And you can draw on conversations that you've had as well, particularly in some of these focus groups. Do you get the sense that CPOs that we're speaking to, they're actually leveraging data, workforce data, people and workforce analytics data to its full capability and capacity in order to tell their stories, deliver on their business outcomes and the objectives of the business? What's your kind of take around this?
I think I'd say that what we hear is a very strong desire when we have this conversation to want to do more. And I don't mean more as in quantity, but more as in more impactful insight into what is going on in the organization using data to support that. And I think then we get into a myriad of conversations about what is blocking that. Some of that is quality of data. Some of it is around the mindset of using it. Clearly, some of it is about the tool set that exists. And for some organizations, it's about the capacity. It's having enough people focused on it. One of the big discussions we have around business transformation with CPOs is the ability to do workforce planning, talent and skills, how do you plan for the future, and the need to have data to guide those decisions. I think it is fair to say almost every discussion we have, there is a reflection that more can be done. There is a desire to do more, but also finding the right thing to focus on is also a big discussion point. Don't try and boil the ocean, focus on the right area. But it's challenging, right? It's very challenging. If you think about any organization with a digital element to their business, projecting more than 2 to 3 years further forward on the skills you need is incredibly tough right now because AI is cutting a swathe across those kind of skills. So it is a skill set that I think is needed really quite significantly to be upped in most organizations because it's really important to having an agile approach to this, enough information to give you an agile approach so you can get ahead of the competition. You can be a first mover on attracting the right talent at the right time into your organization. But it is clearly, I think, from the conversations we have and the data we see from this report, a gap that continues to be one that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating debate that we could probably go into in some detail, particularly around that skills piece. I mean, I think about just myself. Obviously, I'm not a HR person, I'm a marketing person. But even in the last 6 to 9 months, the types of things that my team are doing with regards to the skills they're having to learn with enabling technologies around AI. You and I have talked about different types of AI avatars, about things like webinars that can suddenly be delivered without actually getting Aaron in front of a camera. If to all intents and purposes, it looks and it feels like Aaron. How does that impact us? That's just an example of how the world is changing and the skill sets are changing. And so therefore being able to predict that and then bring it back to the data point, getting people who can interpret and tell that story into your organization, into your HR function is so critical. Just got a couple more minutes left.
Yes.
And I guess it's probably a good time to do a final wrap up from you in terms of, I've hit you with quite a few data points, and I appreciate that you've had quite a lot of conversations at the moment. But if somebody's listening into this and they've just had 30 minutes and maybe they're in the car listening to it, and so therefore they haven't got time to write down all the details on the data or anything like that, is there any pointers that you want to leave people with regards to really take yourself from good to great? Here's a couple of recommendations that we've got based on what we've seen with some of our data.
Yeah. So I think I'd summarize it as this, which is there is a clear proof point now of the value that the people function delivers to business transformation. So if you're not engaged in the strategy, find a way to be engaged, because you will add value and it will help shape the success of the business. The second is that there is a clear need to develop in a lot of organizations a stronger change mindset because of this continual change. Mindset and capability, consistent capability in the organization, some of which you may source outside, some of it which you may have inside, but that development of that change capability. And then the third, I think, is the organizations that can get a good handle on managing data, workforce data, skill data, talent data, to help make data-driven decisions in this market will be the ones that will, I think, be more successful going forward. But if you've not invested in the data side of your organization, and this is not just about getting data right, this is about how you interpret it, how you use it in your day-to-day decision making, how you embed that into your organization is really key, because data will make a big difference to your performance and your success in the market.
Lovely. Well, Aaron, we're out of time, but that was a whistle-stop tour of just some data that we've been given. As I said right at the top of the show, what we'll be doing is we'll be packaging this up, more formalized research that we'll release later on in 2025. But hopefully it gives people a little bit of a flavour. If they want to have a chat with us about some of the outcomes of that, obviously we're around. You can just fill in any of the forms on our website or contact us, and we'd be happy to chat. But Aaron, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast. If you can give us some sort of a 5-star review, that would be great. If you want to chat to us about potential topics that you'd like us to cover, then please feel free to reach out. But for now, from myself and from Aaron, thank you very much for listening. And we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.